Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2020 Barbara Ballinger Lecture. My name is David Seleb, and I am the library's executive director. It's always such a pleasure to have people gather together each year to honor Barbara Ballinger and her 32 years of service in Oak Park, including 24 as the library's executive director. Barbara is joining us today from her home in Oak Park. This event is made possible each year by a generous donation of the Friends of the Oak Park Public Library. And I'd like to thank them personally for their years of service, for their mission to serve the Oak Park community, and for their great generosity. I'd also like to acknowledge a number of the staff members of the Oak Park Public Library who have worked so hard to make this year's event a virtual event, of course. I think the first virtual Barbara Ballinger lecture, forced as we are to do so because of our circumstances, but who have worked so hard and work hard every year to make this event possible. And they include Alexandra Skinner, Jody Colo, Barbara Fitzgerald, Margita Ladaka, and other staff members as well. I'd also like to thank Jason Smith and his team at the book table for their collaboration with us to make sure that copies of Claire's book have been available to everyone who's wanted one. Now I'd like to introduce Margita Ladaka, a librarian at the Oak Park Public Library, who is has a few additional words of welcome and is going to introduce our speaker for today. Margita?
Thanks, David. Hello, everyone. We are so honored and excited to have author Claire Lombardo with us today. For me again, because we had her for the Great Writers Workshop yesterday. She is the New York Times bestselling author of The Most Fun We Ever Had, a novel that is going to be adapted by HBO into a series. She has graduated from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and is a former Oak Park resident and a dog owner, I found out. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Margita, for that lovely introduction. Thank you guys for having me. I have to give my COVID era caveat, which is that I do have a small dog who sometimes makes appearances and is louder than she looks. So get your hackles up or whatever. Thank you guys so much. It is such a surreal delight to be here joining forces with the Oak Park Public Library. It never would have occurred to me at 10, ambling home laden with my weekly armful of books, that I'd be returning in adulthood with a novel of my own. I haven't lived in Oak Park for over a decade. My ties to it dwindle by the day. My distance from it grows as it changes, as I change, but the library remains such a special, formidable place. One in which I can't calculate how many hours I've spent, and one that I suspect will always feel at least a little bit like home to me. Thank you to the library for having me, and thanks to those who have for joining us, and thank you in a special to Barbara Ballinger for your many years spent in service of books, work that is more important now than ever. In thinking about how to structure my thoughts today, I kept circling back to nostalgia. This has always been my favorite time of year. We are now nearing the point that for decades marked the annual Claire Lombardo Halloween birthday celebration, occasions which included my brother and father pretending to be the Blair Witch and terrifying a dozen 11-year-olds within an inch of their lives, and during which, a different year, I commissioned a horrifying double feature of the films What Lies Beneath and Stepmom, ensuring nobody emerged untraumatized in any capacity. It is also leaf raking season, zeroing in on those few days when the ginkgos, radioactive yellow, shed their leaves in one magical hours long go. I always get wistful in October, but especially so this year. I'm nostalgic about everything lately, mourning the state of the world, desperate for human contact as I have previously been able to understand it, longing for both specific people and for the benign presence of strangers. A friend and I were recently talking about how we would kill to go to a coffee shop and rue the irritating person next to us. I miss so many things lately, big things, but little ones too. Offhanded intimacy, offhanded grocery shopping. I miss eavesdropping, I miss hugging, I miss recreational aimlessness. I miss being in a classroom with my students. I miss, may I be the first person to ever utter this phrase, riding the blue line. I miss so many iterations of my life before now, and spent so much time lately in the newfound isolation of my days thinking about those iterations. And it's with this in mind that I'd like to talk about my upbringing in Oak Park, my novel, The Most Fun We Ever Had, and how I came meanderingly to be here today. For me, fiction is nostalgia, and it is very much in this spirit, in my tendency, even in the best of times, which these are not, to want to dwell in the erstwhile, that I have evolved as a writer. I'm going to talk about that and interrupt myself as I am wont to do to read a couple of short sections from the book. One of my earliest memories from around this time of year, 26 years ago, is of the time I escaped from my kindergarten classroom. This would, as it were, kick off several decades of mild truancy and academic evasion, but that was unbeknownst to me at the time. At the time, I was simply hell-bent on escape, desperate to get home. I don't recall how I maneuvered the exit itself, only that I suddenly found myself, join me here visually if you'd like, 3 feet tall, bowl haircut, Velcro sneakers, look of absolute petrified conviction, careening down Chicago Avenue, away from home school, homebound. The crossing guard was off duty. I made it across Oak Park Avenue at the light, then just a few more blocks, and I was home. I didn't, for the record, have a particularly compelling reason for wanting to flee school. My teachers were unfailingly kind and patient. I'm still friends to this day with some of my classmates. Kindergarten's greatest shortcoming was that it wasn't my home. I was a paralytically shy kid. I liked my house, my family, my dog. I cared little for what was transpiring beyond the perimeter of my backyard, the pages of whatever book I was immersed in. I've stayed fairly true to form into adulthood in these respects. School wasn't serving up anything traumatic, not hardly, but I preferred more familiar comforts, spying on my siblings or creating elaborately mundane narratives for my Barbies. I had enough books to last me a lifetime. I had 6 mostly tolerant playmates in my older siblings and my parents, and I had a house full of dolls about whom I could make up boring stories. It will surprise no one who has read my fiction that the trials of my Barbies were as quiet and workaday as those of my adult protagonists. Skipper succumbed more than once to an attack of domestic ennui. It would be years before I began to be consciously aware of this state of being, years still before I would try to harness it generally in my writing, the pleasant white noise of family life, the elaborate and highly specific language that develops under a roof, the constant kinetics of siblinghood, the unending benevolence of the family dog. But I knew even then that I loved it. Of course I wanted to be home, and so home I went. I don't recall what transpired after my jailbreak. I was presumably returned to school by my mother, put on some delinquent toddler watch list by District 97. But the memory stands out to me not only because it speaks volumes about the kind of kid I was, but because I relate to it so potently as an adult. The Most Fun We Ever Had is not the story of my life. The Sorensens therein are not my family. I will repeat this even at the risk of doth protesting too much a couple of times over the course of this hour. This is not an autobiographical novel, but it is rooted in my love of family stories. And my love of family stories is rooted even more deeply in my love for my own family, against the backdrop of how I was raised. One of my goals in writing this book was to create for the reader the sensation that I am constantly seeking as both reader and person, one of being comfortably ensconced in something, awash in familiar noise, literate in a language that only a handful of others can speak and understand. The Most Fun We Ever Had, briefly, chronicles the 50-year evolution of the Oak Park-based Sorensen family, ironclad David and Marilyn, and their 4 recalcitrant daughters, focusing in particular on the year in which their lives are upended by the arrival of an orphan teenage boy. Jonah is placed for adoption at birth by one of the daughters, but resurfaces at age 15 and finds himself thrust into the chaos of the Sorensen clan. The section I'll read now takes place where Jonah meets his birth mother's parents and sisters, his grandparents and aunts, for the first time. One thing Jonah couldn't get over was the common thread in this family of owning insanely ginormous houses, enough square footage combined to accommodate a dozen football fields. The first floor of Wendy's condo was larger than the Danforths' entire house. Now it turned out that the house on Fair Oaks was huge too, but felt more like a home where actual human beings lived. Wind chimes in a motley jungle of plants, bikes propped up on the porch, expensive bikes, Cannondales, and a wooden glider with worn flowered cushions opposite a red porch swing. You ready? Wendy asked him. She'd been entertaining in the car, going down the roster of each of her sisters, describing them physically. Liza's really pretty, but she has that terrible color of hair that's like not even a color, ecru, like a Band-Aid. You won't be meeting Gracie, but she kind of looks like a Cabbage Patch Kid. And now on the porch, she touched his shoulder. Entirely unintimidating, I swear. They're more afraid of you than you are of them. They're afraid of me? Well, no, poorly phrased. She squeezed his shoulder again, and an Infinity pulled into the driveway, and Violet climbed out. Where are the boys? Wendy asked. Home with Matt, Violet flushed. I just figured this might not be a, child-friendly evening. Are you anticipating knife fights? Paternity tests? He watched Violet turn even redder before she said, Wendy, can you not, please? She hadn't even said hello to him, hadn't even bothered to ask if he was enjoying himself in the home where she'd basically abandoned him. But then she was ringing the doorbell, and then the door opened, revealing David and Marilyn, holding hands like those messed up twins from The Shining, a black dog between them the size of a horse. Why did you ring the bell? David asked, letting go of Marilyn's hand to push open the storm door. She reached to take hold of the dog's collar. I just thought, Violet faltered, I just figured because it's the big reveal, Wendy said, the grand dramatic reality show premiere. He liked Wendy for the most part. She was rich and crazy, but she made him laugh and she let him watch The Daily Show. And she seemed to know the best thing to say, always, like now, even when it deliberately made everyone else uncomfortable. They stood frozen for a few seconds, David's arm propping open the door and Marilyn hanging back. Come in, Marilyn said finally. Please, hi, come in. Wendy went first, waving him in behind her. They all stopped again in the front hallway. Mom, Dad, Violet said, stepping forward. She reached out as if to touch him, but instead her hand just hovered a couple inches over his shoulder, like he had lice. This is Jonah. David came over and extended a hand. He was tall and athletic, grayish black hair, fingers smudged with grease. Sorry, I was fixing up Marilyn's bike this afternoon. He took the hand and they shook. I'm David. It's a real pleasure to meet you, Jonah. Me too, he said. I mean, you two. And this is Loomis, David said, taking the dog's collar. He instinctively stiffened, backed up a couple steps, bumping into Wendy. Oh no, are you afraid of... Sorry, he's a gentle giant, but we can... Honey, can we? His face burned, such a stupid thing to be afraid of, a big, dumb horse dog. Marilyn was studying him with intensity. He wasn't sure, but it looked like there might be tears in his eyes. Total shit show, crying, mutant dogs, old people holding hands. Right, David said, never mind, let me just go put him in his room. His room, Wendy said. Jesus, the dog has his own room now? Why don't you come see it, Wendy, David said. He watched curiously as she shut up and followed her father down the hall, leaving him alone with Violet and his grandmother. Mom, Violet said again, this is Jonah. Jonah, this is my mom, Marilyn. Hi, he said, and the next thing he knew, he was being hugged, arms pinned to his sides. We're so happy you're here, Marilyn said, finally pulling away. Now he could see that she was crying for real. Just excuse me for a second, she said, and with that she was gone, disappeared up the stairs, leaving him alone with Violet. Christ, Violet whispered, sounding irritated. Sorry, she's happy. They're both really happy, I swear. The next thing he knew, Marilyn was back, ushering them all into the dining room. He could hear her clanging around in the kitchen as the rest of them sat at the table. David rose to go check on her. He watched as Wendy and Violet made elaborate eye contact across the table. It's totally fine, Wendy said. She's completely insane, but she's totally benign. Wendy, Violet said. Sorry, you disagree with that? Knock it off, Violet said. This is like the most interesting thing that's happened to her since Grace was born, Wendy narrated to him. She's a mostly well-intentioned basket case. Yes, that's exactly what I meant by knock it off, Violet said. She turned to him. This is just difficult for her. Not because of you, it's because of me. She's fine. Ask them anything you'd like, okay? They're so excited to get to know you. Jesus, tone it down, Wendy said. It's not like the chicken is just a tiny bit overcooked, I think, Marilyn said, appearing in the doorway with a platter. He could hardly keep his eyes on her. She was moving so fast. setting the plate on the table on top of a pot holder, messing with one of the tall blue candles, stopping to pick an invisible piece of lint from David's shirt. Violet, sweetheart, am I correct in my assessment that Matt and the boys won't be joining us? The sitter canceled, Violet said. Wendy snorted, but Marilyn got to work again, sweeping around the table, lifting 3 extra place settings. Liza has a faculty meeting, Marilyn said. She'll be over for dessert. Dessert, Wendy said. Dad baked a pie, Marilyn said, and Wendy laughed again. Apple, David said, with salted caramel. Excuse me, Gordon Ramsay, Wendy said. Are you serious? Your father's an excellent cook. All it took was getting him out of medicine. Who knew? Violet, honey, can you start the Brussels sprouts? Who's Gordon Ramsay? David asked. And Jonah, before he realized he was speaking, said, he's a chef who has this show where there's these people trying to be the best cook and they're all mean to each other and like sabotage their opponents. Everyone was looking at him. Ah, David said, maybe we'll have to start watching that, sweetheart, huh? He accepted the bowl of Brussels sprouts from Marilyn. Are you interested in cooking, Jonah? Oh, he said, no, I mean, not really, no. He's a ceramicist, Violet said. Aren't you, Jonah? Sort of, he said. Do you mind if I go to the bathroom? He just needed a break from them, just a minute where he didn't have to be listening to a million people at once. The Sorensen seemed to produce a different kind of chaos from the kind he was used to, a product of having money, no doubt, but there was also an electricity running among the people at the table, facial expressions that meant one thing to a specific person and nothing at all to everyone else. The things that made Wendy crack up that didn't seem necessarily funny, the way David and Marilyn always seemed to be touching each other in some way, her hand over his or his hand over the back of her chair. He was used to being the quietest one at the table. The staff at Lathrop House often cited his tranquility, but he wasn't used to feeling so observed. He was the occasion for this dinner. He wasn't sure he had ever been the occasion for anything. When he returned, he barely had time to sit down before another guest showed up. Hello, someone called. Hey, hi, sorry, Liza, apparently. She was pretty with bright green eyes and a shiny goldish ponytail. He thought Wendy's assessment of her Band-Aid hair was ungenerous. Ooh, sorry. Hey everyone, my meeting ended early and I figured I'd try to make it in time for dinner. Jonah, this is my sister Liza, Violet said. He rose uncertainly, and after he did it, he noticed that everyone else was still seated, but by then it was too late. Great to meet you. Liza leaned in to hug him, which seemed both weird and generous. Sorry to interrupt. That's okay. Can I get you a drink, sweetie? Marilyn asked. Water's great, thanks, Liza said. Liza's pregnant, Violet explained, as though someone needed an excuse for drinking water. Jesus, Violet, he's not an idiot, Wendy said. Can you ever just not talk? You're the one who's narrating everything to him like you just got out of prison. Wendy, Violet said. They were all giving him a headache. He felt like he was watching a dodgeball game. I feel like I've killed the mood, Liza said, sitting down, frowning. I didn't mean to interrupt. I hope you guys might still be getting ready for dinner. We're on a weirdly speedy schedule tonight, Wendy said. Mom's in schizoid mode. Wendy. This time it was David who spoke up. Sorry, Wendy said, waving a hand. Marilyn returned, and when she'd sat down again, Liza raised her water glass. To Jonah, welcome to the family. Liza seemed kind of insane, too. Was anyone in this family not insane? But she was friendly. Cheers, David said. He lifted his Coke uncertainly, and a chorus of clinking followed. Dinner consisted of a series of interrupted conversations. They asked him questions, and he tried to sound more interesting than he actually was. Wendy talked about her core bar class, and Liza talked about her students, and Marilyn never stopped moving, refilling wine glasses and stopping trails of wax from dripping onto the tablecloth. Afterward, David rose to clear the plates. When Jonah tried to help, Wendy touched his hand. No, stay, she said. Dad's got it. So he was left with the women, Violet and Liza and Wendy and Marilyn, all staring at him like a horror movie coven of unassuming kindergarten teachers who were about to disembowel him. Sure, this is a strange thing to say, Marilyn said, sounding almost kind of dreamy. But you have my father's nose, Jonah. He squirmed in his chair. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? He heard his grandmother laugh for the first time, and he decided, sitting in the dining room of their big, weird house, that he liked her. At this time of year 15 years ago, I was probably raking leaves on the front lawn of my childhood home. I tried to think of a more seminal at this time during my teenage years anecdote, but my adolescence in Oak Park was fairly nondescript. I stomped around a lot listening to Wilco and the Smashing Pumpkins on my hot pink Discman. I co-authored an anonymous column in the school newspaper called Just Don't, in which I critiqued the behaviors and life choices of the general populace. I spent most of my afternoons at Oak Park Vacuum, the store my father owned on Oak Park Avenue. I was a highly mediocre student in everything but English, and routinely, following literally in the footsteps of my early days of truancy, ditched my gym and math classes. I have nightmares to this day that in order to continue my tepid progression through adulthood, I have to make up all the days of algebra I missed, or, God forbid, perform the Thriller choreography in order to pass my Dance of the Decades final. I would say those years had little bearing on my adulthood, but for two things. Firstly, my English teachers at OPRF, who fostered my love of literature and encouraged me to write. And secondly, a portly and exorbitantly wealthy beagle named Bagel, without whom I'm sure I couldn't have written the bulk of my extant bibliography. I'm often asked why I started writing, when I started writing, where my storytelling inklings originated, and to some degree, I think the answer to all of these questions is Bagel. I took him for what felt like 17 million walks per day. If you spent any time outdoors in the Chicagoland area between the years 2002 and 2006, you probably saw me and Bagel wandering the streets. And it was this visibility that got me onto the radar of prospective employers. Endless walks around the neighborhood, Discman in one hand, leash in the other. I checked off all the boxes of an ideal caregiver. Already trusted with someone else's living creature, dorky and thus literally available at all times. I started babysitting, and a new era was born. I was in my element as a babysitter in a way that I usually wasn't. I was patient, I had instincts, I was decent at reading aloud. I knew to let the sociopathic seeming kids win at Candyland, and which kids were precocious enough for the darker side of Roald Dahl. I was nerdily punctual, paralytically law-abiding, and good at remembering the codes to garages and security systems. I was also discreet. Since my toddlerhood, I have had the ability to slip in and out of spaces unnoticed, as evidenced by my kindergarten espionage. And this is a good quality in a caretaker, the ability to be stealthy, to be tactful, to blend into the walls as easily as a shadow. But being discreet does not also mean I wasn't taking notes, clocking weird marital dynamics and telling class indicators. In this role, I was privy to people's secrets, the material interiority of their lives. I didn't snoop, but I also didn't not snoop. My eyes scanned the contents of wall calendars while I made dinner. I inferred things about a father's character based on the radio presets in his car. I may or may not have once accurately predicted an extramarital affair. It helps as a writer, I think, to be unimposing, but that status also renders you a benign piece of furniture with whom people share stories about the annoying thing their husband won't stop doing, about their kleptomaniac sister-in-law. I was a safe zone. And even if I were to blab the stories of my employers, I was 16 years old, a weird, shy kid with a dearth of social credibility. Ensconced in the spaces of others, I collected details, stowing them away like a squirrel, lines of dialogue and domestic idiosyncrasies and familial dynamics. This type of work, as it turned out, was beautifully suited to an aspiring writer. When I wasn't spying or tending to children, I was reading, immersed in the narratives of the Babysitters Club and the Sweet Valley Twins, working my way up to Salinger and Lori Moore, progressing to Faulkner and Toni Morrison. These were critical times, I see this clearly now, because they fostered my curiosity about the world. To be a writer is to be constantly excavating, mining details and inferring omissions, dusting off the surface and obsessing over what's underneath. Around this time, 11 years ago, I had, in my second or third most dramatic act of academic rebellion, recently dropped out of college, moved back to Oak Park, and was working at the Academy of Movement and Music under the auspicious title of preschool bathroom aide, the responsibilities of which included changing diapers and figuring out the mechanics of space-age car seats. My sole source of pleasure, the die-cutting machine under the stairs, where I was occasionally dispatched to fashion armies of candy-colored paper elephants. I was existentially unmoored and exponentially unhappy, 20 years old and utterly unsure of what I wanted from the world, in one of those spaces where you're so low that any kind of ascension feels like a laughable impossibility. It's a "God, what are you doing" phenomenon I would later go on to explore in The Most Fun We Ever Had. The unwieldiness of being a young woman in the 21st century, the never-ending indie rock song of "Why did I fill in the blank, take that job, date that guy, buy that couch, let that go." Mine was a state of being that, I'm afraid, followed me around, a miasma, a pigpen cloud of almost comically despairing millennial despair. And I shudder to think what would have happened had a friend not introduced me to the woman who would become my boss at the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. What started as a 4-week volunteer gig became a full-time job, one where I stayed happily for nearly 5 years. I can't begin to enumerate the ways in which my time there changed my life. It helped me to find and hone my voice as a writer. It acquainted me with the vast and wonderful geography of Chicago. It gave me the kind of confidence that comes from knowing your job, doing it well. But it was my work with my clients that has always meant the most to me, that increased my capacity for empathy and deepened the breadth of my understanding of others. I spent my days helping people reckon with and articulate the narratives of their own lives, an act that required absolute equanimity, total objectivity, and one that is inarguably necessary when writing emotionally generous fiction. I wasn't thinking about this actively at the time. At the time, I was simply doing my job, and it was a job where the stakes were high, where my clients were placing their trust in me, placing the basic logistical circumstances of their lives into my hands. But the years I did doing that job, my life again brushing up against the lives of others, remain some of the most important, most fulfilling years I've ever lived. The tenets of that profession, a deep interest in and understanding of others, are ones that unequivocally define me. We are all at our cores impossibly complicated, terribly flawed, endlessly intricately wonderful, and I tried to harness the sensation for the readers of The Most Fun We Ever Had, that of shifting empathy, vacillating perception, the peaks and valleys of coming to fully understand another person. I want my readers to feel as though they're reading about real people. One of my primary concerns as a writer is accurately replicating humanity as it is on a person-to-person basis. And to do this, one not only has to inhabit the psyche of a character, but to love them as well, despite their flaws and complexities and shortcomings. I'm going to read a section now in which Violet, who is concealing the return of her relinquished son from her social circles, is forced to confront another mom on the blacktop. This is not an autobiographical novel, lest I hadn't mentioned that already, but the tenor of the scene was inspired, I must admit, by my days working pickup and drop off at the academy. Violet had come to regard the weekday arrival of 3 o'clock, kindergarten pickup time, with the live wire wariness of a death row inmate. The inside of her infinity, she was certain, was rank with anxious sweat. It was 2:58 and she watched the other mothers gathering, Genevieve Wilmot's mother, and bouffanted alpha mom Gretchen Morley, and Jennifer Goldstein Mayer in her floral visor, tailored and bushy-tailed and chomping at the bit. She hadn't had sex since June. Her hair was in the same ponytail she'd slept in, and Eli was in the back seat singing Shop Around, which she normally would find endearing, but was currently setting her molars on edge. "Sweetie," she said, "let's use our inside voices." In his defense, Eli dropped his singing to an adorably low whisper. "Thank you," she breathed. "Mama," Eli said, interrupting himself, "a lady." "Yes, sweet pea, Mama's a lady," she said. "Don't ask Dada about Mama being a lady. The jury is out at the moment on that particular verdict." Ashton Treslow's mother was walking across the parking lot, cradling a newborn. Violet hadn't even sent her a card. In a past life, she would have made several dozen of those killer Fontina risotto cakes and brought them over, along with a copy of that heartbreaking Iron and Wine album that had lulled Eli to sleep in his early days. Not so long ago, she'd been the first one on the asphalt at pickup, lipsticked and north-faced and caffeinated, Eli strapped to her chest like an adorable bomb. "No, a lady," Eli said. She looked up and her heart sank. Gretchen Morley was coming toward the car, face ablaze with an unnaturally white smile. "Fucking hell," Violet hissed, her face trying to arrange itself into something similar, some alarming shell of a grin that would throw the vultures off her scent. "I'll give you 10 Oreos if you start crying in a minute, buddy," she whispered in Eli's direction, but he had already started singing again. She pressed the button for her window. "Violet," said Gretchen, "if it isn't our favorite recluse." It seemed odd and sad that the removal of Violet's social life from her overall life hadn't had much of an impact on her. The Shady Oaks moms, Gretchen, Jennifer, Ashton's mom, whose name she could not currently remember, had once been vital cogs in the machinery of her days, filling the blank spaces with pottery making birthday parties and lakeside cappuccinos. They were her friends, weren't they? And so why did she care that she never saw them anymore? There was a distance now between the life she'd built and the one she was currently living. A Jonah-shaped distance, a Wendy-shaped distance. So good to see you, she said to Gretchen, her face still frozen in a ghoulish approximation of a smile. We have been so busy. They'd worked so hard, she and Matt, to get to where they were, and yet her reflection in the torso-only recessed walnut mirror opposite their California king had begun to startle her, its athletic thinness and the dark circles beneath newly prominent eyes, big brown orbs that had lost their inquisitive luster and produced only a fraction of the laugh lines she assumed would have accreted over the course of 38 years. She'd skipped her Bikram class 5 weeks in a row, and her children had eaten bunny-shaped pasta for dinner the last 3 nights, though she had ample time to make them something greener and higher in protein. I have never felt so lost in my entire life, Gretchen Morley. Gretchen seemed to grin harder and leaned in closer to Violet through the window. I didn't want to say anything in front of the other moms, she said. I know I forgot the cupcakes for the Sudanese bake sale. I know my roots are showing. I know it's my turn for book club, and I know I'm supposed to pick something less dark than Flannery O'Connor. I just wanted to say congrats, Gretchen said, and offer you any of Harrison's old stuff if you want. I'm sure you have plenty from Eli, but just in case there's anything you gave away. Any? Wyatt told Harry he's getting a new brother, Gretchen said, and then horrifyingly she winked, closed one big tastefully shadowed eye and opened it again. You still look so thin. No, but also, of course, this was happening, surprising and inevitable. Of course, her darling, enthusiastic kindergartner had been unable to keep the lid on their family secret. Of course, she never should have asked him to lie. Of course, she'd done a botched job of all of this, but fuck it if she wasn't gobsmacked to be confronted with it now in her very own car by a woman holding her bouffant in place with a $40 Lululemon headband. Well, thanks, she said. That's because I figured it was probably early. That's why I didn't say anything in front of the ladies. I'm not pregnant, she said, and Gretchen paled. Wyatt's new brother is my illegitimate love child, and he hails most recently from a rustic trash heap in South Oak Park. She swallowed. It didn't work out. Who cared if it was bad karma? It was also bad karma to shove your big coiffed head into someone's car and ask her if she was pregnant. Oh, Gretchen said, oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Well, her quick-thinking litigator brain again, tortuous fallopian tubes. She'd read about them in Us Weekly. It's this awful condition, tortuous fallopian tubes. Gretchen squinted. Torturous? Tortuous, Violet corrected her, keeping an eye on the dashboard clock. Well, that's so terrible, Violet. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Yes, well, she said, it's been really hard on all of us, so if Wyatt says anything, it's best to just not give it much credence. It's confusing to the kids. It's confusing to the kids when Mama throws them directly under the luxury party bus of Gretchen Morley. For a bizarre handful of seconds, she found herself missing Wendy, the wildly creative liar who'd cooked up the year-long Parisian farce that had gotten them into this mess in the first place. Certainly this news would travel further. Certainly Gretchen, who'd very likely already shared the news of Violet's phantom pregnancy with the other moms, despite her insistence that she hadn't, would go slithering back to her entourage and share with mock sympathy the tragic tale of Violet's imperfection. The Shady Oaks moms were her friends only as far as surface level analysis, Pilates and mini Bowden. Social currency was everything in this world, but it could lose or gain value in an instant, and someone could steal your shares right out from under you if you weren't paying close attention. From the back seat, Eli whimpered. Just a second, honey, Violet said. Well, listen, Gretchen said, I know you're super mom, but Violet was sure she wasn't imagining the condemnatory glint in the woman's eye as she said this. If you need anything, if you need me to take the boys so you can go to the doctor, just say the word. She smiled. She'd choose Jane Austen for book club and bring a case of wine. For a brief moment, she even imagined one day confessing the epic fallout of her youthful imprudence, sharing that Wyatt's brother had not, in fact, been quashed by her reproductive organs and was currently enrolled in very expensive Israeli military training on her sister's dime. Behind her, Eli began to wail. "Oh," Gretchen said, and she backed away from the car. "Okay, well, I'd better go. Anyway, sorry about, I'll text you." She watched Gretchen bounce back across the blacktop, and then she turned to her son. "Sweetheart, what is it?" Eli stopped crying as abruptly as he'd started and grinned at her. 10 Oreos. She started laughing, the kind where you are also partially crying. She had always associated with exhaustion and psychopathy and her mother. At this time, 7 years ago, I was living in Urbana, Illinois, in a profoundly depressing and incongruously candy-colored student housing complex that abutted something called a horse research farm. To this day, I remain blissfully, aggressively ignorant of the nature of that research. My aforementioned fascination with people had led me to believe I should become a therapist. I would write fiction as a pleasurable hobby in my free time, I told myself. And so I was midway through a very expensive master's degree in social work that I knew unconsciously, I think, from the moment I applied, I wasn't meant to be getting. I had recently overcome not one, but 2 bedbug infestations, and I was spending every free second I had, and often seconds that should have been allotted for my schoolwork, flirting with the darkest, most masturbatory liaison known to man, that of writing a novel. I was a caricature of a woman as aimless and friendless and brooding as I had been during my bathroom aid era, and my life smelled vaguely of livestock. It would have been a good time for a Hail Mary, or to mix some metaphors, some miracle from left field, a sign from the cosmos, a call from some benevolent, life-changing wizard, but instead I got the call that my father had died. I don't recall much of the intervening year, but for that I was more miserable than I have ever been. I was utterly lost and terribly sad and newly hard-edged, wading through my days only with the aid of the grim propeller that shows up when the worst imaginable thing has happened. And my life had taken on a greenish David Lynchian tincture. My neighbors had somehow managed to maneuver a full-size organ into their apartment and lulled their children to sleep with eerie and weirdly hallowed versions of Yankee Doodle and the Farmer in the Dell. One of my classmates was concocting a thesis around the notion of therapeutic pole dancing. I began to see a trio of identical and identically dressed adult triplets on the bus some mornings, and to this day I'm not entirely convinced that they actually existed. My professors seemed not to notice if I read novels under my desk during class, so that was what I did. No one seemed to know how to handle me. I was the sad, lonely figure in her scary horse commune, draped in quilts and chain smoking, marred to the core by grief and loss and cynicism. But I had company in books, those written by others and the one I had been working on. And in those months, I started to grow something out of absolutely nothing, to cultivate lives on the page when my own life felt so utterly hopeless. My father's death, aside from eviscerating the world as I knew it, threw certain parts of my life into relief. I began to contemplate what I was doing and why, and how tenuous everything was. I wrote and kept writing, and a story began to grow, gained autonomy and momentum. I was alone in practice, but my life had become strangely peopled. I was accompanied unflaggingly by the Sorensen family. They moved into my apartment, taking up space, their voices filling my head. Writing about them became an escape for me. Spending long winter days in their company provided an outlet from the messiness of my real life, which often felt so dark as to be unlivable. They became my surrogate family, in a sense, except their fate was in my hands. Weaving their narrative afforded me a sense of control that was utterly absent from my actual life. My characters grew from my grief, began to gain texture and dimension in a way that I, lost as I was, couldn't do myself. I crafted them word by word, scene by scene, slowly getting better acquainted with them, growing to understand their psyches and idiosyncrasies. I had created my characters, and when I was leading the charge, I got to decide how much they had to endure, who kept their head above water, and when it was okay to laugh again. The great pleasure of reading fiction, for me, is the permission to be elsewhere and to dwell there deeply. And it was very much in this spirit that I wrote the bulk of The Most Fun We Ever Had. I missed my father. I missed my life before, what now felt to be capital B before. I wanted to harness the comfortable feeling of being ensconced in a fully intact family. I wanted to gather as many of the trappings of real life as I could, sprinkle them all over the place. A cigarette on the roof, a crunch of a leaf, a chilly morning off Lake Michigan, laughter at inappropriate times, a second of charged eye contact that changes the course of a single decade. A single memory recalled utterly differently by 6 different people. And from there it grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, rooted in the familiar, but suddenly free-flying, advancing like a child with a mind of its own. Again, I will say the Sorensens are not my family. Their life is not my life. Their house, let me stress this, is not the house that I grew up in. I did, however, create them. People talk about characters writing themselves. And I will say firmly that these characters didn't, but they did take on lives of their own. And this ended up becoming my saving grace, the way I slowly retaught myself how to be a person in the world. The stuff that followed will be of no surprise to anyone who has been listening to me for the past half hour. Reader, I dropped out of school again. I'm going to zoom a bit through what followed for me. At this time of year 6 years ago, I had returned once again to Oak Park, this time miserably as a nanny, and I'd used my entire life savings, something to the tune of $700, to apply to graduate school for fiction writing. The Iowa Writers Workshop was among my 11 applications, thrown in mostly as kind of a why the hell not, because I already had all my eggs in one basket and was basically throwing that basket into a raging fire. But alas, at this time of year 5 years ago, I arrived at the Iowa Writers Workshop in a state of complete petrification, armed with an 813-page draft of my novel and the utter conviction that my acceptance had been a clerical error. In a bout of imposter syndrome for the books, I almost had a panic attack on my first day of class and had to strategically sit by the door for the remainder of the semester, lest I passed out from anxiety. Being at the Iowa Writers Workshop is like being surrounded every day by 100 iterations of the most confusing person you've ever met. But I found a writing life there, a community, friends, a mentor, a routine. I developed a writerly reputation for being long-winded. My stories were known for their plotlessness and for the fact that the characters therein tended to like each other quite a bit. And I took this as sort of a challenge. I love discontent. There's a reason it's the fodder for so much fiction. But I wanted there to be something good at the core of the most fun we ever had. I wanted there to be secrets and lies and suburban ennui, but I also wanted the reader to be able to turn over some stones and find absolutely nothing sinister. Find simply characters who have pure and lasting love for each other. Find, in effect, the space that my kindergarten self had been so eager to return to. It took me about 79 drafts, during which the book fluctuated from between 700 and 920 pages. But I eventually finished my novel, and my agent sent it out to publishers. And so it was at around this time of year 3 years ago that I found myself calling upon one of my professors, the very professor in whose classroom I had, a couple of years earlier, nearly had a panic attack, and asking him if he'd put me to work. This is not some obscure literary term. I was waiting to hear the fate of my first novel, the fruit of years of work, metric tons of love and heartache, and I had run out of domestic projects of my own. I had already winterized the windows of my old farmhouse, as my father had shown me, with plastic and a hairdryer. I had already cleaned the interior of my car and washed every conceivable dish and alphabetized my books first by title, then by author. I needed new real estate, new distractions. I arrived at his house with an open mind and was relieved beyond words when he handed me a rake. I spent the better part of that day among the leaves, not ginkgos this time, but oaks, a seemingly endless quantity. He came out at one point to check on my progress. "This is both the best and worst job for a perfectionist, isn't it?" he asked. "You know it's impossible for you to rake every single leaf, right?" My book found its home that night with the editor I'd dreamed of working with, and it seemed only fitting when, several months later, it was given a cover spotted with turning leaves. I'd like to read one more brief section from the novel in homage to its ginkgo trees. Marilyn tried to tune out her daughters, adults in body if not in mind, while she peered dubiously at the turkey in the oven, which smelled okay but still looked frightening. She waged this battle annually. She closed the oven unsatisfied and drifted over to the back door, looking out at the yard and breathing in air that didn't smell like savory meat. I just went in to break up a brawl. Arms wrapped around her waist, hands rested on her abdomen, but they broke it up themselves before I could even open my mouth. She put her hands on top of David's and leaned back against him. So who died, Mr. Calhoun or Mr. Whiteman? Huh? She smiled. Nothing, no one, come here. She gripped his hand, unlatched the back door. What are you doing? Abandoning our children. She pulled him outside and down the stairs. She settled on the bottom step and he followed more slowly, his long legs folding achy into acute angles. Dinner smells good, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Thank you. Good-looking crew in there too, huh? A little annoying though, if I may. She snorted. Yeah, just a little. How did we ever live with all of them at the same time? She didn't reply. She rubbed her cheek against the knit grain of his sweater. Come here, she said. I couldn't be any closer unless I was sitting in your lap, kid. So much more confident than he'd been when they first met, emboldened by the years. She lifted her face and kissed him, and the stairs squeaked beneath them, aging green paint that would flake off and embed forest flecks into their clothes, atrophied woods swelled with decades of rainstorms and snowstorms and pounded back into submission by a century of heavy footsteps. They both felt the December chill through the insulatory dearth of their sweaters, and David reached an arm around his wife's shoulders. They both turned slightly to a sound from the kitchen, the thump of the refrigerator door and the clink of glass. Refueling, David said, and she nodded against him. Christ, those girls drink a lot of wine. I'll have to apologize to the recycling guy on Monday. He seems like a forgiving guy. She kissed him again. Think they're back at each other's throats out there? He asked. Oh, probably. Let's not worry about it. Those ancient stairs, those 6 times repainted stairs, with layers of red and blue and yellow and brown and white, and now they're green, creaking ominously but never to the point of concern. Those ancient stairs upon which the two of them had helped Gracie learn to work her tiny baby legs, adept then at walking on flat surfaces but not inclines, upon which Wendy had probably done unspeakable things to boys with Napoleon complexes and offshore accounts, upon which Liza and Violet had once erected a lemonade stand, blind to the fact that they were unlikely to attract customers by setting up shop in the backyard, upon which now Marilyn was stretching out, arching her back uncomfortably on the stair beneath her husband and impelling him to join her. Old time's sake, she said, but he shook his head, moving his knees to accommodate her. My back's not cut out for this level of holiday whimsy, my dear, he said. She lay back flat, her husband's knees tented over her thighs in a corduroy bridge, and looked upward. They had 5 trees in their backyard, 3 ginkgos and 2 oaks, all of which were older than they, older than their parents, older than anything. The ginkgos had shed weeks ago, but the oaks were different, always Marilyn's favorite. Stragglers, late bloomers, the last to get their leaves and the last to lose them. There were a few remaining on the branches, misshapen handprints, hanging by a thread and waiting to fall. 2 seasons in Chicago, the old joke went, winter and construction. But there were so many more, she thought, dozens of seasons, some only a few hours long. Idiosyncratic little pockets between the definitive stretch of autumn, the bright flash of spring. This season now, which may possibly last only a few minutes, where you could wear a sweater outside in December and there were still a few leaves on the trees, and the warmth radiating from the person next to you was enough to make it all bearable. And the season that would follow when they went back inside, their skin foggy from the cold air and the warm proximity of each other, their bodies overtaken as ever by their children, hands on their shoulders and eyes on their every move, and voices in their ears, hands and eyes and voices that would never fully comprehend the complexity of their own origins. Hey, love, she said to him, imploring, but she wasn't sure what for. He hummed in response, both echo and acknowledgement, and held out his open palm. She shifted beneath her husband, reached up, and took his hand. At this time last year, I was in Frankfurt celebrating, somewhat unbelievably, the publication of the German translation of The Most Fun We Ever Had. I spent my first day there wandering around a public garden among some of the largest ginkgo trees I had ever seen, and I was forced to acknowledge the sweeping depth of a preconceived notion I didn't know I held. These trees that I had thought been specific to the Midwest, and perhaps even my hometown, my home, my specific front lawn in Oak Park, in fact have myriad intricate deep-set roots elsewhere, notoriously hardy roots. The ginkgo is believed to be the oldest of any tree on the entire planet. 6 ginkgo trees in Hiroshima survived the explosion of the atomic bomb and remain alive to this day. There are ginkgo trees quite literally all over the world, shedding their yellow leaves in those majestic day-long rainstorms. I was in a fog for much of that trip, caught up as I am now in autumnal nostalgia and marveling over the basic truths of my life, that I had written a book, that someone had published it, that someone else had taken the time to translate it, that there will always be leaves to rake, that the fall, no matter where I am, will always smell exactly like it did on the front lawn of my childhood home in 1991. And while I considered this, the Germans were awash in delight over the fact that I had a dog in my novel named Goethe. I was asked repeatedly, why had I named a dog after their city's literary hero? And I had to tell them, first embarrassed by the simplicity of my answer, but gaining pride with each repetition of the response, missing my hometown, my ginkgo leaves, rides in the station wagon, rides on the blue line, those minor pronunciation dramas that Midwesterners are so fond of, the vast and wonderful geography of our somber city, that I had named Goethe the dog, quite consciously, after the street in Chicago. Thank you guys so much for having me. That's all I've got. Anyone?
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. Margita,
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, I'm here, sorry. We do have some questions submitted to the Q&A, Claire, if you take a look.
Oh, sure thing. Okay, where should I start? The dialogue in this book is vivid. How did you develop that ear, and what did you do to hone the ability to write it? You referenced missing eavesdropping. Perhaps that's part of it. That's a terrific question. It does come a lot from my eavesdropping. I make my students at the beginning of every semester go out for an afternoon and just listen to other people talk and record their conversations. It's sort of an ethically murky assignment, but I do think just sort of having your ears open to the world around you is key to writing fiction that feels honest. And that is how I approach my dialogue. I also read my work aloud and sort of have an ear tuned for if it sounds like, natural conversation. I've gotten some criticism for this book for the fact that people interrupt each other so much throughout the dialogue, but that's something that to me feels inherent to being a person who talks to other people. So there's always, constant interruption. So yeah, I would say sort of those two things are very much eavesdropping and also just kind of having an ear tuned to how dialogue comes across the page. I missed the beginning. Is the book loosely based on your childhood home? No, it is not. I actually had a very specific house in mind, not a real house, but a very specific house that the Sorensens lived in. And I gave this book to one of my sisters early on, and she said the same thing. She said, this isn't our house. That's not our foyer or whatever. I had a very Oak Parky house in mind. I'm drawn generally to Oak Park houses. I bought my first house this summer, and it is very much a house that could easily be in Oak Park, though it's in Iowa City. But no, it is not based on my childhood home. Okay, are you open to talking about what projects you're working on now? And are you planning to write a book based on your awareness of issues of homelessness from your work with the homeless in the past? Great question. So I'm working on a couple of projects right now. The book, as Margita said earlier, is being adapted for a television series for HBO. And so I'm working on the pilot of that, which has been really exciting and a really sort of incredibly different experience from writing a novel. And as to your second question, I haven't thought about writing anything fictional about my time at the Coalition, but it's certainly something, something to think about because I had such a sort of wealth of incredible experiences and people with really incredible stories. So I'm always kind of on the lookout for that as I move through the world. Let's see, any updates on the HBO series? I wish I could say yes, but because of the time that we live in, it's a precarious time for Hollywood as it is for all other industries. So we're still at work on it. Everyone just keep your fingers crossed for me. I would ask that. Let's see. Are you currently writing a new novel? I am, ostensibly, yes. I'm working on actually the book that I started writing when I got to the Iowa Writers Workshop about 5 years ago. So I'm resurrecting that project, which has been really, really fun. And I've been very grateful, I think especially lately, to have a fictional world to dwell in. So keep your fingers crossed on that as well, please. Thank you for an engaging hour. I thoroughly enjoyed this. You're welcome, and thank you. What are you currently reading? That's a great question. I just reread The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I've read like 8 times. It's a book that I like to pull out in the fall because it feels very sort of atmospherically timely. I'm rereading a lot of things lately. I just pulled off my shelf a novel called The Cosmology of Monsters by Sean Hamill, who is a friend of mine and a classmate of mine from Iowa. This book has been described to me as the most fun we ever had, but with monsters. It is much more than that. And it's a really, really terrific book about a family who has a haunted house. And there are some sort of magical elements to it. So I would recommend that. What else am I reading? I always forget that I've like ever read a book when someone asks me this question. Yeah, I guess those are 2 that I've got right now. Let's see. Thank you for doing this. You're welcome. So I'm wondering, do you read your critics and how do you handle it when they are negative? I don't believe I've heard many writers say that they never read their reviews. I don't believe those people, or at least I am not one of them. I try not to read my reviews. I read them religiously when the book first came out. And I have since sort of backed off. I will never look at the Goodreads page for my book. That's a trauma waiting to happen. And as to how you deal with that, it's just sort of I think it's kind of exposure therapy. You get good reviews, you get bad reviews, and you kind of have to desensitize yourself a little bit and distance yourself from the work. Going to graduate school for fiction writing really helped me with that because it forced me to take a really intimate part of myself, which was my fiction, and give it to a room full of people who were literally tasked with ripping it to shreds. So that helps. It helps to, become less precious about your work. But mostly I've just been so grateful for the fact that this book has an audience, and the fact that, of course, it's not going to be for everyone, but I try to sort of focus on the fact that this thing that I wrote is out in the world, and that's such a wonderful gift that I'm so grateful for. And so, happy to meet readers. And that's been a really pleasurable part of publishing a book, is all the really terrific people I've gotten to meet, stories I've gotten to hear. So yeah. This is the most I have talked, I think, in the last 8 months. Hey Claire, hi Mark. So fun to have you share all this last hour. Can you please share a favorite Bagel memory? Oh, that's a great question. Bagel was such a great, weird little dog. He was like sort of like an ornery old man. I'm trying to think. Bagel had a pool, so I would sometimes go swimming with Bagel in his pool, which was always sort of fun. Yeah, I don't know. Bagel and I saw a lot of sights together. Yes, I miss him. Let's see. We have a question from a children's librarian. What are a couple of your favorite books from childhood? I have been sort of scouring little free libraries in my neighborhood lately. I've become like a scourge because I never put anything back in them, but I've been sort of pilfering old Babysitters Club books and Sweet Valley books. I loved those as a kid. I'm trying to think what else. Junie B. Jones. I loved the Amber Brown books. Some other kids' books. I loved The Little Prince. It's also the only book in my life that I've ever read an entire book of in French. Those are a few. I've been really having fun with, seeking out old middle grade novels that I loved. That kind of goes with my seasonal nostalgia lately. Let's see. Hi, Claire. I was very interested in reading your book's attention to the class differences between North and South Oak Park. Could you comment more on this? Sure. I lived in both North and South Oak Park during my time there. And I was very aware of the perception that one had of the other, even though, I mean, it's such a small area. But I think it's evidence of these small dramas that crop up, even if you're in a, a relatively small space, a small town in this case. So I did want to play a little bit with that. Jonah's foster family lives on the south side of Oak Park, and Violet, who is very, her life is highly curated and highly expensive, is very much aware of that being a different space than the North Oak Park that her parents grew up in. But the sort of humor in that for me is that it's all kind of the same. It's all, it's all one town. There's not a lot of difference. But I did want, I feel like, and that's very much present in Iowa City. People talk about like the people on the other side of the river who are like the fancy people. These things exist everywhere. And so I wanted to touch on that in this novel because I wanted the setting to feel as three-dimensional as I could.
Hey, Claire, if you don't mind, I'll
Yeah.
just a couple of more questions from chat, and then we'll work to conclude. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Let's see. There's one here. See, I am amazed at how well you get inside the head of a 60-year-old mother. Was any of that due to conversations with your own mother?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. My mom was immensely helpful in my writing of this book, and I think has read it like 10 times or something. That's very much how I did a lot of, this isn't a novel that required a lot of like hard research, but it required a lot of character research. So creating a character like Marilyn, who, is in her 60s and has, is the mother of 4 children, very much outside of my personal wheelhouse. So I definitely relied on my own mother, on a couple of other outside readers, just for authenticity. Yeah, that was enormously helpful. Yeah.
Awesome. The last one here, approximately where did you live in Oak Park? What involvement would that have in the movie? I love the eavesdropping. I do that too.
I think we all do, right? Yeah. I grew up on the north side of Oak Park. I grew up near Chicago Avenue and Oak Park Avenue, so just a couple blocks from home school. And I don't think that will have any involvement. I have no idea what the next steps are. Yeah, I forgot the question already.
What involvement I think the question is, will you specifically have in the movie if you know?
Oh, will I specifically have in the movie? Gosh, I hope a lot. I don't know. It's I'm executive producing, which is sort of a nebulous term that I've yet to meet anyone who fully understands what that means. But I think I have some say-so in aesthetic decisions, but we'll have to see. It's going to be exciting. We are, as I said before, still at the preliminary stage of writing that pilot. But it's just been, there's a really tremendous, Laura Dern and Amy Adams are involved. There's a really tremendous team of women in particular.
That's amazing.
So yeah, it's been really fun so far to see what happens.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Margita, you want to help us conclude?
I want to mention, I saw one last comment that was just interesting that somebody said, Claire, we bought your childhood home.
Oh, okay. Congratulations. Good to know.
Good. Go ahead, Margita.
I just want to say thanks to everyone. Thanks for all the great questions. Some of them were my own questions. I love TV shows, so I was also interested in the HBO series situation.
Oh, great.
And thanks again, Claire, for coming out and working with us, where we had to change a lot this year and we had to make it virtual, and for going along with all the steps.
Thank you guys so much. This is really special for me. I really appreciate it. And thank you guys for adapting to our changing times and having me anyway. So it's really been a pleasure. And thank you for everyone who came as well.
Yes, thank you, Claire. Thank you, everyone. It's, again, my pleasure to have been here to welcome you all to the 2020 Barbara Ballinger Lecture. Barbara, I know you're at home listening with some of your friends. I hope you enjoyed this as much as we all did. Thank you again, Claire. Congratulations, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.